Hi everyone, I'm Jeremy Goodwin, Head of Pensions at Evershed Sutherland. Thanks for listening to Pensions in a Pod, a podcast where we take a look at the latest developments in the pensions world. What we really wanted to share with you here is our insights in terms of what we believe really matters, what's really going on here. Today we're going to be looking at the new legal requirement for schemes to complete an own risk assessment, or an ORA as we're going to be calling it for today. So you're probably well aware, an ORA is a mandatory self-assessment process to look at a pension scheme's governance and risk management required by the Pensions Regulator's General Code, which came into force on the 27th of March 2024. Now, I'm delighted to be joined today again by Charlotte Cartwright, one of the partners in the team here, and our special guest, drum roll. We've got Nick Gannon from the Pensions Regulator. So Nick is a delivery lead at the regulator with particular responsibility for ORAs. And so he's very much the kind of main man to talk to for delivery of what's expected of schemes looking to complete their first ORAs. Now, we're very aware from talking to a number of clients and people across the industry that people are really thinking very hard about what their own risk assessments should look like, how long should they be, what particular features should they pick up, what makes a really good ORA. And so looking forward to the conversation today to really try and bring out those practical aspects of what the regulator will be looking at when we're looking at these first ORAs. From a timing perspective, so many schemes will be currently finalising their ORAs where they have a March scheme year end date, or currently working through these assessments where they have a December scheme year end. So first question to Charlotte, if I may. So can you talk us briefly through the background to ORAs and what trustees need to be doing now?
Yes, certainly, Jeremy. And as you say, Jeremy, Charlotte's back again. How could Charlotte resist when we're talking
The joy
about
of
own
it again.
risk assessments? So trustees are required by law to have an effective system of governance, an ESOG, and the General Code then steps through the different parts of that. So effectively providing a framework for what trustees need to have and what they need to do. And then the ORA is about testing how well that ESOG's working and how trustees are managing risk. And the General Code includes a bit of a shopping list of items that the ORA needs to cover. That shopping list actually comes from legislation, which explains some of the wording that we see there, but typically we'll look to the General Code for it. And it is pretty broad. It touches on most aspects of a scheme's operations, from administration to investments to risk registers. One point that's probably worth bringing out actually at this stage is that the shopping list typically starts with the word how. So, how the trustees assess the effectiveness of the risk management system, how they assess the scheme's funding needs, how they assess operational needs, etc. But I know from previous discussions with Nick that probably unsurprisingly, the regulator expects the own risk assessment to go further than just describing how you approach those things, and does expect you to lift the bonnet and do an assessment of, for example, how well they're working, or really the ORA would be arguably a little bit pointless. You've already touched on the when this needs to happen. So most schemes are in the middle of it, with scheme year ends either around March or the end of December. And thankfully, we've all worked through that slight maths problem of trying to work out exactly when our ORAs are due.
Thanks, Charlotte. Charlotte, you've slightly stolen my thunder to some extent, but Nick, in terms of from your perspective, when you're looking at this from through the lens of the regulator, what's the key purpose of the ORA, and what are you really hoping that schemes will be doing when they're looking to complete their ORA?
I think the what we came to this was that it's not a compliance document. It's not intended to be something that you have to do and you submit to us and we give you a big tick and a gold star and all that kind of thing. It's intended to be useful for the scheme. So from that point of view, we've sort of set out to give trustees the opportunity to be introspective, to actually consider how it is that their scheme is working and how it potentially could work a bit better, where those risks are, clues in the name, I suppose, and how potentially they could actually work to address those in the future.
That's interesting, Nick. So in terms of schemes being introspective and trying to think about where the issues would lie, it suggests that actually where the regulator is going in relation to this is not so much to kind of criticize schemes in relation to this, but wanting to make it a genuine exercise for schemes to be looking at genuinely, how are they doing things, and how can they try and improve things? So to being quite honest in these auras, is that right, or are they is there a risk of them being criticised and, I don't know, held to account for things, etc., etc.?
Yeah, I think especially this first one. Yeah, absolutely. Honesty is the best policy, because effectively the only thing you're cheating as a trustee is yourself if you're not
Yes.
being strictly honest. Um, I mean, yes, we're not, as I said, we're not expecting auras to be submitted. We may have conversations with a few schemes in the future about the auras, but that will be more around kind of what the contents is, what's going on at the next stage, that kind of thing. So yeah, I think this is a genuine opportunity for trustees to actually have that moment of introspection, to consider genuinely how the scheme is going, and to start thinking about how things work out in the future, and how they can actually spend their limited time and budget to improve governance. And improving governance is in our interest, is in their interest, is in their members' interest. So hopefully it's just kind of one of these things that just helps smooth things along.
That's really great to hear. So, Charlotte, coming to you if I can. So, in terms of trying to think about the schemes that you're advising so far when they're looking to complete their aura, what are the main pitfalls from a legal point of view for trustees to be avoiding?
Yeah, so there are a few different pitfalls. Actually, the two that I call out are probably the two different ends of the same spectrum, and Nick's just started talking about one of them. It's less really of a legal pitfall. I think it's a more general use of time pitfall, which is that there is a risk when you look at it that you spend too much time on the reporting and less time on the review. So a bit of a tick box risk. There's just so many reporting requirements on schemes at the moment that I think there is a risk that this becomes yet another report for trustees to get through alongside their implementation statement, TCFD report, chair's statement, etc. So the risk there is really that the focus goes on the document rather than the more useful bit, which is that opportunity to take a step back and think about where things are going well, where things could be adjusted to maybe make them more effective or less time consuming or more focused on key risks. And then the other pitfall is really the opposite end of that spectrum, which is probably the overcomplicating it risk, shall we call it? Because as I mentioned, the list of items that the ORA has to cover includes most areas of a scheme's activities, from admin and payroll to cyber to investments. And at an extreme, it could be a really detailed and really quite expensive exercise with layers of verification. But in my view, certainly that's not what it should be. And it's almost missing the point, because schemes already have a risk management function to monitor risk on an ongoing basis. Many have subcommittees dedicated or partially dedicated to risk. So the aura really supplements that work. It's not about duplicating it. It's about taking stock, checking that all those different bodies are functioning as they should do, and whether looked at holistically, there are any gaps or anything that can be improved.
Thanks, Charlotte. I was thinking about that as you were talking, as Nick was talking, because obviously there's a whole spectrum of schemes out there. I mean, there'll be the schemes that have got the huge governance budgets where this maybe isn't such an issue. There's many schemes out there with very, very different kinds of governance budgets available to them, and the time, the resources they've got to be thinking about these things at length is clearly limited. And so in terms of that kind of proportionality, that's interesting to understand more about. So again, Nick, from your perspective, are kind of pitfalls and thoughts in relation to this from your perspective, please?
Yeah, I think as Charlotte's sort of outlined, I think there is a risk of going too deep into these things and seizing on one particular risk. And I think for me, when traditionally people have said risk and the word pension scheme sort of in roughly the same sentence, it's focused on investment risk. But as Charlotte said, there's an awful lot of other stuff that is actually at least as important in terms of risks to the way your scheme operates. So you've got your admin, you've got your cybersecurity, things like that, that I think sometimes don't get the attention. So I think there is a tendency to go, well, it all works fine, so we'll just skate over that, and not properly consider it. So I think there is a tricky balance to be had, and that on this first iteration of the aura, could potentially be a little bit tricky to find.
Yeah, I get that. So let's try and get into that a little bit more if we can, please, Nick, because we're very conscious. You said that the ORA isn't something which is going to be submitted, so you're not expecting to get hundreds of these landing on your desk. But it just occurs to me that if you've got a scheme that's in supervision with the regulator, or if something else goes wrong and you're needing to then dig into what the scheme is doing, wouldn't be the world's biggest surprise, I guess, if you're then wanting to see the ORA, to try and actually see what the scheme's like from a governance perspective. And so if and when you do get to that situation where, for whatever reason, you are actually wanting to have a look at the scheme's aura, what's good going to look like? And actually, when will actually you be thinking, oh, wait a second, when I look at this aura, I can see why we've now got problems coming through on this scheme because their aura doesn't include this, or this, for example. So what are the kind of warning signs that schemes should be aware of?
That's a very tricky question. I think schemes ask, what does an aura look like? And I think we're in the situation of not necessarily knowing ourselves what they're going to look like. So, a good aura could highlight these risks that we're potentially having a conversation with the scheme about separately.
Yeah.
Or, as you say, it may not highlight any of them, and in which case it's possibly not a brilliant aura. It might point to sort of governance issues elsewhere as well. So I think it's very much a case by case, and the scale and resource and things like that are going to have a real influence in terms of what we actually see, and I don't necessarily want to say quality because that's kind of suggests good and bad, but I think if it's working for the scheme, if it's actually been valuable for the scheme, then that's probably what it's supposed to look like.
Yeah. Okay. So it's more the process which schemes are going through in order to produce the aura, frankly, almost, rather than the actual document itself.
Yes, yeah, and I think it's not just the process that it goes through now, but it's also what happens afterwards as well. So, you've got a while now until your next one, but what are you going to do with that time? Do you just lock the aura in a drawer and forget about it, and wait until the next time one of your advisors comes and reminds you, or do you actually make it something useful that's actually fed into your governance and actually used to improve those things that you've identified, or just kind of built into regular processes so you can kind of have a rolling process that builds up to an aura at the end of the 3 years. So it's not just this one discrete panic at the end of the period.
Thank you, Nick. And I guess from your perspective, any kind of practical tips which schemes should be trying to think about in terms of what the aura should be looking like? So from their perspective, is this a document which is 300 pages long, or is it something which is 2 pages long? And I guess any other practical tips for our listeners to be thinking about?
Yeah, I think length is always one of those sort of how long does my GCSE coursework have to be kind of questions. So yeah, I mean, I've realised that when we first consulted on the aura way back, whenever it was, that we'd actually described something that was, 3/4 of a tree in terms of what we expected of it, and that's a long way from actually what it should be.
More like a sapling, but a 3/4 of a sapling. Yeah.
Hopefully less than that. Yeah, well, I don't know what kind of the tree to paper ratio is, but
yes.
So yeah, somewhere I think probably between, I don't know, about a dozen pages and a couple of hundred pages, which I appreciate is quite a big range, but also I'm talking to an audience that is quite a big range of schemes here. Yeah. So, I think it's very difficult to tell in advance. And if a scheme, going back to that resource point, hasn't necessarily got the resource to do an all-encompassing aura now, but can recognise that and go, well, at the moment, we've done this much, but we can build it into our processes and we can make a regular thing of it, and it will be better next time. Then that's perhaps an element of introspection there that's paid off in its own right. So yes, I think 2 pages probably a bit too short. Yeah.
Thank you. So, Charlotte, how does that compare? So, obviously we're seeing a number of auras come across our desks already. So, how does that compare to what we are seeing in practice?
So it is pretty similar. So we're seeing schemes taking slightly different approaches, but they are within that, was it 12 pages to 200 pages spectrum? You'll be pleased to hear, Nick. And I think it's also fair to say there are some common themes that we're seeing coming out of those
And just before
ORAs.
we go, so I guess we're not seeing them to be as long as that, are because in reality, I mean,
Yeah,
even
it's
for the
true.
larger schemes, I think we're not seeing anything more than 40, 50 pages so far. Is that fair?
I think that is fair, and also, rather to get into too much detail about it, it also depends on how much is the actual text, how much is
Yeah,
supporting
the
evidence that
appendices and all
often
that. I
gets
get that.
attached,
Yes, yeah.
etc. So, but it feels like they're certainly within that structure. But as you say, the core report is towards the shorter end of the ones that we're actually seeing at the minute, and maybe that is to do with one of the trends that we're seeing, which is, and most schemes, certainly the ones that I'm seeing, are using templates that are produced by benefit consultants, because the actual ORA itself, if you start from a blank sheet of paper, could be a pretty daunting exercise. And going back to what we were talking about earlier, there is a big risk that you could just spend too much time on the reporting rather than the underlying reviews, which is why many benefit consultants have come up with a tech solution and effectively a template to plug that data into. And personally, I think that the solutions that I've seen are great. They allow trustees to spend the right balance of time between doing the review and writing the report, so that the report doesn't take on a life of its own. The key is then just to make sure that it is a truly bespoke report, because I suspect if Nick suddenly sees 100 reports that look very similar, he might get slightly suspicious. But the key is using those templates in the way that they're intended, which is to streamline the reporting phase, but still make sure that they are bespoke to the scheme.
That's interesting. So, Nick, do you agree? What's your sense, given what we were just talking about in terms of the kind of key thing in relation to the aura? Yeah, but it is almost the kind of thinking and that introspection process you talked about, as opposed to the actual end document. So when consultants, have been putting together these really great programs, and pretty much all the big consultancies have them. What are your thoughts about that? Do you see that as being a good thing, or do you see risks and challenges which trustees should be thinking about when working with their benefit consultants and working through their kind of standardized tech-based solutions here?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we got asked for was a template, um, and we've always resisted it on the basis that if you sort of start heading down the road of a template, then there's a risk that you lose the creativity, if you like, that
Yeah.
can come with an aura, and you go into a tick box mentality, um, which is not what we intended at all. But I appreciate that, frankly, the most terrifying thing we can probably give a trustee is a blank sheet of paper and tell them to write a report. So yes, I quite understand why consultants have come out with the systems and the processes and things that they have, and I've seen a few, and I will not recommend any of them for fear of favour or anything,
Yes.
but I haven't seen one that sort of misreads our intention for the aura. They all seem comprehensive, and they're all there with what appears to be, the best of intentions and the helpful aspect of it, as Charlotte says, to kind of streamline things. I think, the risk with them is that people kind of go down the spreadsheet or the web page or whatever it is and kind of tick the box and go, yes, well, we've done that,
Yes.
without actually thinking about what's actually implied beyond that box.
Yeah, and actually, Nick, I wonder if that's coming back to Jeremy's question to you before, when he said, "What am I seeing in practice based on how you were describing the regulator's aims for this document?" I think one of the other themes that I'm seeing in practice is, as you'd hope, lots of schemes are coming out of their aura saying actually they are compliant with the key areas of the code. Lots of schemes had a big exercise to do that gap analysis and make sure they were closing those gaps. So that is as you'd expect. But as you said before, I think there is a big focus on this continuous improvement piece. So making sure it's a living, breathing exercise. And so calling out the focus areas of where they could make those improvements, be that some schemes are looking at, I think, risk register improvements. So for example, some trustees want to move towards monitoring, say, top 5 systemic risks as well as lists of risks and risk registers, or maybe focusing more on what best practice looks like on cyber, given those risks to schemes, or linked areas like business continuity plans, which I think all feeds into what you've just been saying, which is you end up with a relatively short tick of certain areas, but then it's that broader look forward and saying, where can we build on this and move forwards?
Yeah, it's interesting that reference to risk there, because it's almost not the risk, it's almost the mitigations for the risk, which I guess you're wanting to kind of really get focused on here. So I guess that's the kind of key thing for trustees from a legal point of view. Nick, again, from the regulator's point of view, if there's one key thing which you would say, and you went back to talking about your big tick and a gold star. So if you were to be awarding a big tick and a gold star to schemes with their ORAs, what's the one key thing which you'd say for schemes to be thinking about and to take away from today's talk?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a distillation of some of the things that we've said already, which is it's not a compliance document, so don't be scared of being honest. But equally, I would say don't lock it in a drawer after it's done. Try and you've identified inevitably some areas that require mitigation, and if you have the time and the resource available to you at some point over the ORA cycle, actually address those and have a plan for when you're going to address those, because they're not going to go away, are they? Not by themselves anyway. So yeah, I'd actually turn it into something that is more than just a headache in March, and something that's more useful in the long term.
Yeah, so your ORA kind of sits alongside the risk register and the assurance framework in relation to the risk register, either mitigations, and really becomes part of all that sort of wider network of risk register, assurance, mitigation piece, and ORAs as a kind of package.
That's right. Yeah. It should all be one sort of big governance package or governance improvement package.
That's interesting. Thank you. So one last cheeky question off the hand, Nick. In terms of your work as policy lead at the regulator, anything else on your desk at the moment which you're particularly working at and want for us to think about for future podcasts, perhaps?
Well, at the moment, my focus is almost entirely on CDC and the latest iteration of our CDC code, which we're hoping to get into Parliament in the not too distant future. So our consultation closed in mid-February, and we are working hard to deal with all the responses that we got.
Very exciting, and an area that's very close to our own hearts. So thank you, Nick. And it won't be a world's huge surprise to our listeners to know that we may have Nick back again at some stage in the future to talk about all things CDC, which would be very exciting for everyone. Talking of very exciting for everyone, just also wanted to flag our pensions conference here at 1 Wood Street, the morning of Wednesday, the 6th of May. Delighted to have Nausicaa Delphas, the pensions regulator, speaking. Kate Jones, the chair of the PPF, Aaron Punwani, obviously CEO of LCP, and various others. So please do get that into your calendar to come along to the morning of Wednesday, the 6th of May. And the last thing also, just by way of housekeeping, is to make sure you've definitely downloaded our UK pensions tracker, which keeps you up to speed with all the developments across the pensions landscape. So please do go onto our website, get signed up to all our mailings, etc., and please do download the UK pensions tracker. So I hope you've enjoyed that today. A huge thank you to Nick for your brilliant insight into all things own risk assessment related. So really appreciate that. Thank you very much. And thank you as ever to Charlotte for your thoughts today. And we will look forward to talking to you very soon on our next Pensions in a Pod. Thanks all for listening to this latest Pensions in a Pod episode. To access previous episodes, please have a look at our website, on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, where you can find them all stored for your enjoyment. We look forward to coming back to you in a month's time to give you the latest insights on what's really going on in the legal pensions landscape.